My name is Andrew Ibarra from the Ateneo de Manila University. I'll be the chair for this round, and my preferred pronoun is she. I now invite my panelists to introduce themselves and their preferred pronouns if they like.
Jake Bustos, he. Mikiro, he.
Julian.
Sharada, she.
Jason, he.
And I now invite the debaters to introduce themselves as well.
I'm Jay, she.
Moya, he.
Sean, he, they. John, you, they.
Sunny Curie.
What's your question?
Also, he.
Okay, without further ado, let's call on the Prime Minister. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the fight for recognition for social movements, we believe that the best way in which for these movements to move forward is to claim ownership over those movements and reject points of identities that detract away attention from that movement. Because we argue, the world that we live in right now, the ability for you to identify with a particular social movement and your identity is an immutable characteristic that cannot be hijacked by other individuals. So what is this debate about from opening government? We believe that this debate will better provide value to the discourse, best own identity. As I think this debate is about evaluating on whether or not the belief system of other allies is legitimate or not, but we think that the position in which we should take in this debate is that your identity is a unique fight and you should claim ownership over that, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we believe that even in most contexts, that the support that these allies have is immaterial. We believe that they can support in any way they want. But on principle, we would argue that the movement can't utilize these individuals as point of references in the way in which they forward their fight, ladies and gentlemen. So what is the problem in status quo that exists? Firstly, we will argue that often the discourse is hijacked and the attention is attracted away, especially by individuals who can often take a position of being able to opt in and opt out of that particular discourses as well as that particular identity. We point to examples like when in the fight for feminism, there were massive attention detracted away because at the point in which male celebrities like Justin Timberlake or Joseph Gordon-Levitt took upon a position of being a feminist, the discussion then became about why is it that other female celebrities did not participate in the fight of feminism? Why is it that women didn't recognize their own right to fight for their voice? Or even in the American community, when Rachel Dolezal took a position of pretending to be an African-American woman, as opposed to the discussion being about whether or not we are according certain rights to these communities, it then became about her and her life and whether or not she's cuckoo, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. We think it's problematic because the discussion then becomes about who necessarily owns that particular discourse and how do we best move forward. We think we can do that better under our side of the house. So firstly, why do we think we need to exclude allies? Let's talk about privilege, ladies and gentlemen. So what does privilege necessarily mean? We think that the privilege that you have as a community that is not oppressed is the ability to be recognized on a human level, that you do not need to be acknowledged for the different immutable characteristics that you face. So things like your race, the way that you look, or your identity is never rejected on face because people presume it to be your privilege and your right to be recognized. We don't think that this exists for many social movements, i.e. individuals who are homosexual, transgender, or even female, ladies and gentlemen, because oftentimes people presume that there's a position of being able to change those characteristics and they don't accept that, right? Yeah. Lastly, secondly, so what does this discrimination include in status quo? We think that it includes many different things on an implicit level, tacit or even explicit. Things like being able to get jobs, ladies and gentlemen, or pay parity that people face in status quo when you are of a particular community. Women make 70 cents to every dollar that a male makes in status quo. We think that it's problematic. At the point in which the discourse is hijacked by these groups of individuals, the ability for you to move forward as a community becomes problematic. How so? Because we will argue that when you are utilized as a point of reference in these social movements, number one, on face, there is an inability for us to relate to you on the fullest extent when you are said to be the person that is heading these particular movements. How so? Because oftentimes people who are privileged allies, their decisions and their positions are based on the sum of your cumulative life experience and how you approach life, ladies and gentlemen. We think that oftentimes as a social movement, your benefits of being able to argue that my cumulative lifetime experience becomes diluted at the point in which someone comes in and says that yes, there is a problem, but I think that I can make it a lot better. The way in which people perceive this movement then becomes a lot detracted because they can just say, well, you already have someone in your movement who recognize your ability to attain social rights. Why do I now need to grant you the same sort of rights? We think that oftentimes, especially your benefits are necessarily compounded by your lifetime experience. The fact that you had to face implicit discrimination years and years over years and years, we think that this is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, sir. We think that the ability for you to move forward and attain social rights as well as legislative right to protect your rights should not be detracted at the point in which people can claim plausible deniability and say your discourse is enough because someone is supporting you, ladies and gentlemen. So how do we then view discourse in status quo and why we think it's problematic? Often we look to mainstream point of references, i.e. Rachel Dalzell, Ben Affleck, or Taylor Swift, in the way in which we approach things, in the way in which we approach fights for rights of social movements. The problem then becomes there is a position or a rhetoric that can be argued that your identity as a social movement or the characteristics that you are relying upon as a social movement is not an immutable characteristic anymore. At the point in which people can opt in and opt out, or at the point in which people can say, I relate to you because I face the same sorts of discrimination, ladies and gentlemen. This is problematic because even if people say and look at those point of references and agree, yes, you think it's a problem, I would as well, we think, number one, it is very hard for other individuals within the status quo to pull away from that privilege and divorce themselves from that position of privilege, ladies and gentlemen. So even if you agree that some individuals face discrimination, at the end of the day, specifically for this group of privileged allies, you can always opt out or pull away, or at the end of the day, hand your coat and say, I've done enough for the day, they can do the rest themselves, ladies and gentlemen. This is why when people took a position of dressing up in like burqas and hijabs and walking around and facing that discrimination, whilst initially they believe that I understand what it means, they don't understand that when they take it off, they don't have to face that discrimination anymore, but Muslims do, ladies and gentlemen. We think that there's a problem. How do we best change this course then? Yes.
Look, it's true. These people can choose to leave as and when they do. But in the interim, they've gotten your calls to the airwaves and they've made it much more appealing to the moderates.
Okay, firstly, we will argue, why is it that you need that stamp of legitimacy in order for your social movement be granted credence in that particular scenario, ladies and gentlemen? This is why my argumentation of plausible deniability is important, because at the point in which no one wants to fight for your social movement or something that is unpopular or not mainstream anymore, that is when your social movement dies out, ladies and gentlemen. We think that at this particular juncture, what is popular is what people usually opt into. We think that's problematic. So the trade-off that we are making right now as a community, when you allow for privileged allies to exist, is a sort of perception management becomes a lot skewed, right? Because as I said, a movement is as good insofar as someone legitimate taking upon that position or being the mantle of hero in that particular regard. So it can go one or either two ways. Number one, either you hijack the discussion and then it becomes about you, or you can claim plausible deniability. We think that we make discourse a lot better at the point in which we acknowledge that we understand, but the ownership to those discrimination and the ownership to those issues lies insofar as to that community and that community being able to claim that rhetoric. We understand that there are individuals who can argue that they understand how Muslims feel, how transgenders feel, how homosexuals feel. But you cannot come forward and claim ownership to that problem and say that you are the point of reference we are supremely proud to propose. There's no mic.
Thank the previous speaker. Now call on leader of the opposition.
So, of course, our opposition also wants good for social movements. We want more power to the more rights for minorities. And what we think is that the exclusion of privileged individuals, yes, from discourses necessarily does more harm than good. That generally speaking, these individuals are essential for the fight for rights for minorities. Three things I'll talk about. Firstly, how inclusion adds to movements. Secondly, why privilege is inherently a bad metric. And thirdly, why underlying principles of equality are even more important. But before that, let's deal with some rebuttals. The first thing that we have to deal with is this idea that they put forward that these individuals attempt to hijack discourses. First thing, even if the distraction occurs, one, you have more airtime anyway. The very simple fact that there is a big noise and din about this is more airtime for your social movement. It means more attention for your social movement, and we think that is generally a good thing. The second thing is that many a time, these so-called distractions, in fact, legitimately question certain aspects and flaws and criticism of the very movement. The very example they raised, questioning why other female celebrities were not supporting the feminist movement, is illegitimate critique. Which is why we think, at large, these things are good for inspecting the flaws of such social movements and moving them and progressing them to an even better, perfect state. But certainly, even if these distractions initially are bad, for example, in the Gamergate movement, where social justice warriors and white knights attempted to like for women in the spaces, try all that. We eventually steer it to our own benefit, like how Anita Sahi really push it to a UN paper on cyber violence. But we think at large, generally in the worst case scenario, and just about big waving for these men, at large, we're still able to capitalize on these particular distractions and hijacking. Second rebuttal then. This question of whether or not these allies necessarily mean you don't need any more, or, oh, the fight is already finished, we don't need any more fighting. You've got to be kidding me. One, we think the multiple waves of feminism show that the fight is never over. The fact that we have 3 waves of it, and the 4th wave that is incipient right now, regardless of how much social capital and support the feminist movement gave. But secondly, we think that generally speaking, the more allies and the more social approval you get, the more momentum you attain. Because people want to back the winning horse. People want to be popular. People want to say, hey, I fight for social justice too. And that's where we think at large, again, that you have all these allies. The fight is never over. The fight is momentum towards more rights for minorities. Third thing and final thing that we have to rebut. The question of whether or not these allies pulling out at any point in time is necessarily harmful. As we already raised in the POI, we don't think they addressed it. Initially, we get something out of these people, even if their participation. But I think that side government has conflated celebrity and privilege. At large, a social movement that fights for rights is one that firstly has a number of and therefore will always continue to fight for it, meaning continue to exist me the society, still continue like the bandwagons wherever and then join these particular things, we still think they add more momentum at the end of the day. Before I move on, opening.
No, your momentum is contingent upon what is mainstream and what is popular. Why should you utilize a privileged individual as a point of reference to get that step of legitimacy?
Because we don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive or harmful from the ones that are based on the minority at large. And I'll give you 3 substantives right now as to why they are absolutely necessary for social movements. First thing, on why inclusion adds to social movements rather than detracting from minority discourses. 1, the vocalization of ally voices in discourses is necessary because at large, privileged individuals have nothing personally to gain most of the time from the progress of these rights and these movements. It means that in order to get the fence-sitters and the moderates and the other people who don't stand to gain directly from these particular things, you need other individuals who also stand nothing to gain from these particular things, i.e. privileged individuals, to say, hey, look, we stand nothing to gain, but this is something that is right. This is something we have to do. And that's when it becomes essential, because you need these discourses and narratives in order to convert the other people who also stand absolutely nothing to gain. In fact, may have to sacrifice their own things in order to forward the rights of these people. It means essentially then that if you don't use these privileged people like Emma Watson cannot make her he for she speech, you cannot forward the very idea that men should be fighting for women either. That exclusion necessarily means that those people who stand to lose from the gaining of rights will not participate in this particular thing. That's when you forward a us versus them mentality, which destroys any sort of inclusion or forwarding, or sacrifice of these things. And it becomes all the more important when most of the time privileged individuals are essentially the social political elite. They are the ones who hold the power, who can change the laws, who can change the social milieu to make your minority get its right. Meaning that these are the people whom you have to convert in order to gain anything. They are not the inconsequential players that side government says they are, because men who control every damn thing necessarily have to let go of it before you gain it. Unless, I don't know, maybe you'll go into armed rebellion or something, but we don't see that happening. So you have to convert these people, and therefore you have to include them. But why is privilege an inherently bad metric? Because normally the premise of exclusion is based on your disprivilege. Okay, the more inferior you are, the more we therefore give you and legitimize your narrative. We think, firstly, this is an arbitrary line, but secondly, this has a deadly chilling effect on discourse, because it essentially becomes a race to the damn bottom. That's why it pits black feminists against white feminists, because I am more underprivileged and hence I should be more listened to. And that's when we think there is a massive harm, because it destroys the unity within these particular movements and destroys the legitimacy of the narrative moving forward. Finally, why is it that the underlying principle of equality is the most important? Because you need the social capital and the support and the public reception to get this. And what is most important is this driving narrative of hope and equality for everyone. In being hypocritical, in not including all these privileged individuals, even if they are privileged, essentially you are destroying your legitimating discourse of equality, because you are fighting for equality, but you yourself have now decided to destroy equality with this particular policy, and therefore we think you are hypocrites who ought to die. For all these reasons, go and OO.
Thank you, previous speaker. Now call the two presidents.
If I was a Muslim man in Islamophobic Europe, if I was a homosexual in homophobic United States of America, if I was a woman in any other patriarchal society, the question now becomes, how best do I forward my rights? How best do I strategically position myself in order to claim ownership of my identity, in order to gain some social traction? Do I then listen or refer to individuals who have benefited from the tacit discrimination onto my identity in order for them to shape my identity, for me to get any form of movement? We believe on side government that is not the answer. We shouldn't rely on other individuals who benefited from our discrimination. There was a line in Kaishan's speech, if you listen towards the end, where he conceded, and this is the exact mentality that we needed to break down, that we needed these individuals to gain any momentum. On side opening government, I will prove to you why we need to break that rhetoric in order to own the identities and cultures that Jay so proudly fought for and was just easily brushed aside by leader of opposition. Let's deal with the first question. Is inclusion better? The first contention coming from side opposition was that airtime is the end-all be-all of why you need inclusion. We think that this was unnuanced to the responses that Jay already brought up to her speech. That A, it is based on other considerations, things like how popular these sort of movements are and palatable to how these movements are to individuals on the ground. Secondly, it also does not negate the distractions that you might gain from things like controversies with regards to the point of reference that you're dealing with. So for example, when Rachel Dolezal immediately told individuals that she was a black woman, all the airtime was invested into telling individuals that she was not a black woman, rather than focusing on the plight that she had to face and the plight of that community. We think that even though if you have airtime on your best case scenario, it's still contingent on these facts, and therefore you do not get the maximization of optimal airtime that you wanted to get. Secondly, he wanted to contend that this inclusion leads to better momentum and better momentum for the social movement. We think that firstly, this isn't exclusive to having you at the forefront of these movements. More often than not, and later I'll argue, it's how you detract these sort of movements and how you create disunity when these people become points of references. But what happens right now is, on the outside, when you can forward it as your own and claim identity to those things and be able to tell other people that you stand to lose nothing by giving me my rights, therefore that creates some form of movement and some form of momentum, because these guys can still, in their own private spaces and even in the ballot box, vote for your policies too. So that still creates some form of momentum on our side as well. Lastly, he said that the reason why people vote for, the reason why this momentum exists is because these people have nothing to gain. We think that using this rhetoric, then there is a likelihood for no change to occur at all, because people might think, I stand to lose nothing, I stand to gain nothing, so they take an apathetic position on these sort of issues, right? We think the reason why people that do not vote for social movement issues is because they think they have something to lose. Therefore, the best position to take in these instances is for the people who claim the identity on their own, who have a legitimate stake in what they have got and what they deserve to get, coming out and say to these people that they have nothing to lose in the first place. That is the reason. That is the best way to forward these sort of ideologies and forward this and ease the fear on the ground that they have, that they would stand to lose anything by forwarding me my rights. Right. Second question. But before I move on, I'll take a point.
Yeah. Inclusion may not get you the most efficient airtime, but exclusion gets you downright no or bad airtime. So deal with the comparison.
No. If you exclude some people, you can still opt for other things. Like the media isn't solely racist to everyone else. You can still have some form of rallies or protests. You can still make some form of claim to parliament or whatever, right? It doesn't mean that you are immediately lack of airtime the moment you don't include a white person in that movement. Moving on. How do we make discourse better, right? Acknowledging the fact that there was no responses to things Jay said, things like claiming ownership, things like detracting the attention you get, things like these individuals being able to opt out of these identities the moment it is convenient for them to do so, right? These are instances which immediately make and hamper the discourse on your side, because immediately it's either hampered by the ideas of controversy or scandalousness, or secondly they think that your freedom, your identity means nothing because one can simply change and move out of it. Simply, for example, you can in an Islamophobic Europe, you are then levied on unrealistic expectations to immediately be secular the moment that identity clashes with the beliefs of other people. You know, like just like in the quarterfinals, right? But we think that the important thing right now is to show individuals that identity liberal belong, you acknowledge, and you no longer can use the rhetoric where they have to accept your identity. But the more important this issue is how I feel when I walk into a racist community or in an Islamophobic community. Claim my
Exist a nexus of oppression and privilege. We are oppressed in some ways and privileged in others. And when a question comes as to who I should listen to figure out my identity, the answer is simple. I should listen to whoever I want to listen to. But that presumes that everyone gets a argument for ownership. And you see, perceptual ownership. So, obviously, feminists first group. Is poor, and that this cause is able to be steered by a point in which you're playing the game of can't run away from them, yeah, because the world is if what is mainstream is not to accept, and what your goal is to make more people accept those things, then what exactly you are doing is you are trying to pander to the mainstream and the popular. You cannot run away from trying to popularize feminism or gay rights or whatever cause it is you fight for. You can't say that now you want to break the link. And the fundamental point is this: people just aren't interested in goals that can't appeal time prefer goals that can probably appeal to some notion more important in that regard. Time also is crucial because even if it requires a less gateway, some random examples about big people like Rachel Dolezal saying that when Rachel Dolezal come up, people had not to know she was actually a black woman. The speaker, the discussion was very community specific to this extent. I'm supposed to make for their vote because great voices. This is really bizarre for the majority of this privilege and last point of discrete rebuttal is that these guys are prior beneficiaries, so we ought not to rely on their input. Again, this is bizarre because all these social movements ultimately rely on the traction of people who are prior beneficiaries of privilege, i.e. the rest of society. So you're at a point at which you're seeking outreach, Madam Speaker, you are reliant on them, regardless of whether they are speaking for you or merely voting for you in the voting booth. But before I go on closing.
Even if minorities are to get access to the limited power positions and airtime, wouldn't this allotted time be given towards the privilege of minorities, i.e. white feminists and non-flamboyant homosexuals?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that is the harm that you get from opening government, when you literally arbitrarily choose a bar for privilege and people under that bar are shut out, but people above that bar, so you have to compete within that hopefully hierarchy of privilege. Your opening government models produces this problem. Okay, 2, on outreach and change. This is going to be quite brief because I want to get to this thing about discourse within the group. But we only tell you things about how, firstly, equality is an important narrative because it appeals to the momentum of the silent majority is absent because the silent majority doesn't speak in the public, doesn't get to set the agenda of what is popular, what people care about. So it fails in terms of providing that kind of educative gateway step onto social issues and things like that. It also tells you about allies are better able to communicate their message to other people of privilege, who lack a stake in the fight, because they are better able to, it's easier for people to understand when someone who is like you, if you want to buy the idea that people are just more likely to appeal to people who are of their identity, than when someone who is not from the identity group is speaking to them. So that's better conveying that. But more importantly, on a macro level, the optics of rejecting a group altogether from your social movement or social discourse undercut moderate appeal, because they undercuts the idea that these movements are about equality, undercuts the very reason why these people, why most moderate people or most clueless people care about these movements in the first place. That's really harmful. Worse yet, the inflictors don't care extremists and make care about men. The extremely more men's rights activists comparatively more seductive. That's the no thank you. The bad actors. Yes. Okay. So last opt out. I want to talk about is discourse and dealing in it. So I don't really what they tell difference. There are serious here. They didn't tell us we want to preserve the idea of uncertainty of identity. That's really dangerous, Speaker, because this is pre-positive argument for why that is the case. Social movements are ultimately something quite basic, which is to make their heroes live better.
Let's be realistic here. This is a zero-sum game. Powerful positions, leadership, those individuals are inferior. Or the flip side will happen is that those minorities will in turn conception that are fasting. I have no A speak on it must be improved because I support this motion. Rebuttals will be integrated. First, clash in this debate. Who will get these resources? Opening opposition said that this is not we think it is. Why? Not